One of the things that the sort of Marxist labour process discussions were about, and I mean, I was, in fact, in a Capital Volume 1 reading group with a bunch of the most amazing feminists who've gone on to do wonderful things, and we sat every week reading through Capital Volume 1, trying to figure out what Marx said about the gender division of labour, and critiquing the notion that Marx somehow thought it was natural, and we were trying to say it was social. We'd had a notion of labour as being really manufacturing labour, wage labour, and it was really was at exactly the point where we were trying to extend the notion of labour to domestic labour. And I remember very well that in Cambridge at that time, it was renowned for having the best Marxist theorists of the economy, Marxist economists. And I can remember us all very bolshy feminists saying to them, it's all very well your labour theory of value, but what about housework? What about domestic labour? Isn't this part of labour? And we were trying to argue that you couldn't have production without reproduction, that this thing was a kind of cycle. So it was really the beginning of theorising domestic labour as work, the beginnings really of feminist economics, which has now become a very big area, as you know. And we were very interested in how it was that the division of labour or sort of gendered labour market segmentation, however you want to call it, like both what we call horizontal and vertical segregation. The segmentation of the labour market, which is what I mean by that is that men do certain kinds of work and women do certain kinds of work, and how come there were more women school teachers and more male steel workers? How had that come about, and how was that reproduced, and how was it that the kind of work that women did that was kind of gendered and thought of as women's work seemed to be much lower paid than a lot of the kinds of work that men did? How did that system come about? How was it reproduced? How did it operate?
My intersection to this was Michelle Barrett's work in Women's Oppression Today, which was groundbreaking and kind of traveled, I think, to the US through the cultural studies legacy. Of course, in the US, we hadn't had this long set of conversations about labor. And the Marxism we got was a very different kind of Marxism, and the socialism, or the social theory we got was a very different kind of social theory, right? But it had this kind of major impact to put the question of the reproduction of the human race onto the agenda as something that has long been written out of any economic kind of theories or any economic equations. And so in a slightly different way, but almost from the same context, that kind of turn that you're describing that was personally important ended up galvanizing a whole kind of generation of, I think, students in the US who may have been pre-feminist.
I met only some years ago Eli Zaretsky, right? And I said to him, your book on the socialist family, socialist feminism and the family was so important to us. He laughed and said, you know it all better in London than anybody knows it in kind of America. Right. Because the other thing had been that there'd been, that book was important because there'd also been a kind of very much, and I don't know again how much that was the case here, a lot of interest in psychoanalysis, right? There was a kind of intersection of kind of Freud and critiques of Freud at that time, which Michelle was quite involved with, what was called the sort of radical psychiatry movement. And so there was a lot of discussion about the sort of bourgeois family and what the family was and whether where the critiques of the family should come from. And the radical psychiatrists and, R.D. Laing and those people were doing their critique of the family. And feminists were doing a different critique of the family. So those things were intersecting as well. But the feminists were much more talking about the sort of unpaid labour and that it was an oppressive place and we needed to get out of there and we needed to have economic autonomy.